They will tell you I was a murderer. They will tell you I was a monster, a vengeful woman who let hatred rot her soul the same way rot works through fruit, slowly, invisibly, from the inside out, until the thing that looked whole from the outside had become something entirely different within. They will tell you I poisoned innocent people, that I used the skills given to me by the family I served to destroy that same family, that I was dangerous, that I was evil, that I was exactly the kind of slave they had always warned good Christian men and women about. Let them tell it that way. Let them have that version. It costs me nothing now. My name is Delphine. I am 44 years old. I have cooked for the Beaumont family of Savannah, Georgia for 23 years, since I was brought to their kitchen at age 21, with flour already on my hands from the plantation kitchen where I learned my trade. I have fed this family through births and deaths and celebrations and ordinary Tuesdays. I have cooked their Christmas dinners and their Easter hams and their wedding feasts and their funeral repasts. I have stood over their stoves in Georgia summer heat that made the kitchen feel like the inside of a furnace. And I have produced from that heat food so good that Mr. Beaumont boasted about his cook the way some men boast about their horses. For 23 years, I fed them beautifully. For 3 of those years, I fed them something else as well. Not enough to kill. I want to be clear about that because I have thought about it carefully for many years, and I believe the distinction matters. Not enough to kill, enough to weaken, enough to confuse, enough to make the machinery of their lives run rough and slow and uncertain, the way a clock runs when someone has removed one small but essential gear. Enough to make the Beaumont family, which had spent 20 years expanding its wealth and influence and social standing in Savannah society, begin instead to contract, to diminish, to lose things they had assumed were permanent. I did this for 3 years, starting in the autumn of 1841, 3 weeks after they sold my daughter Celia to a rice planter in the low country of South Carolina. 3 weeks after I watched a wagon carry my 14-year-old child away from me down a Savannah street, while I stood in the Beaumont kitchen doorway with a dish towel in my hands and felt something inside me go as quiet and cold and purposeful as a stone dropped into deep water. They sold my daughter to settle a gambling debt. That is what it came down to. Mr. Beaumont had lost heavily at cards over the course of the summer of 1841, losses that had accumulated quietly while his wife planned parties and his sons attended their academy, and I cooked 3 meals a day in their kitchen as if the world were continuing normally. The losses had reached a point where a creditor was pressing, and Mr. Beaumont needed to liquidate an asset quickly, and without the kind of public sale that would announce his financial difficulties to Savannah society. Celia was 14 years old and had been trained since she was 8 to assist me in the kitchen. She was quick and careful, with her father's hands. Her father had been sold away before she was born, so I only knew his hands from her, long-fingered and precise, capable of the delicate work that kitchen labor requires. She could make pastry at 12 that would have made a French chef envious. She had my mother's gift for seasoning, the ability to taste something and know immediately what it needed, an instinct that cannot be taught and cannot be learned and had been, in the 2 generations of my family I knew about, the thing that made us valuable in kitchens. That value is what made her saleable. A 14-year-old enslaved girl trained in high kitchen work, with the kind of instinctive cooking ability that produced food people talked about, was worth considerable money to a rice planter who entertained frequently and wanted to improve his table. The sale was arranged privately, the price agreed upon, the paperwork signed, in a transaction I was not told about until the morning it happened. Mrs. Beaumont called me to the parlor. She was a thin, carefully maintained woman in her mid-40s who wore her social position the way she wore her jewelry, constantly, deliberately, as evidence of something she needed the world to confirm. She sat in the chair she always sat in and looked at me with an expression I recognized immediately as the expression she wore when she needed to deliver information she expected to be received without reaction. "Celia will be leaving today," she said. "She has been sold to Mr. Harrington of Beaufort County. The arrangement has been made." I stood in the parlor with my dish towel still in my hand. The room seemed to rearrange itself around her words, furniture shifting slightly in my vision. the light from the window changing quality. "When?" I heard myself ask. "This morning. The wagon comes at 10. I had 2 hours. 2 hours to find Celia in the house, to hold her, to try to give her in 2 hours, everything a mother tries to give a child over the course of a lifetime. 2 hours to memorize her face and her hands, and the specific way she laughed when something genuinely surprised her, and the sound of her voice saying, "Mama," in the dark when she was frightened. 2 hours before she became property transferred from one ledger to another. I will not tell you what those 2 hours contained. Some things belong only to the people who lived them. I will tell you what I felt when the wagon turned the corner and disappeared from sight. I felt the cold stone drop into the deep water. I felt the quiet settle over everything. I felt something that was not grief and not rage, but some third thing that had no name I knew of, something that belonged to mothers who have had their children taken, something as old as the institution itself. I went back to the kitchen. I began to plan. To understand what I did, you need to understand what I knew. And to understand what I knew, you need to understand how I learned it. I was born in 1797 on the Hargrove plantation outside Savannah, the daughter of a cook named Josephine and a field hand named William, who was sold away when I was 3 years old. My mother raised me in the kitchen, which meant she raised me in the only classroom available to her, teaching me everything she knew about food and plants and the chemistry of cooking in the language of demonstration and practice, rather than books or formal instruction. My mother was an extraordinary cook, not just skilled in the technical sense, though she was that too, but possessed of a knowledge of plants and their properties that went beyond cooking into something older and more comprehensive. She had learned it from her own mother, who had learned it from hers, a chain of knowledge passing through women in my family that stretched back further than any of us could trace, back to somewhere before the Middle Passage, back to knowledge carried in memory across an ocean that had tried to drown everything. She knew which plants healed and which plants harmed. She knew which roots could bring down a fever and which leaves could raise one. She knew which berries were deadly in quantity and merely unpleasant in small amounts, which mushrooms could stop a heart, and which could simply confuse a mind. She knew the difference between a dose that killed and a dose that weakened. She understood plants the way a scholar understands texts in their full complexity, not just their surface meanings. She taught me everything, not for the purpose I eventually put it to. She taught me because knowledge passed down is knowledge preserved, because she understood that the only things that couldn't be taken from us were the things we carried inside us, because she was a mother doing what mothers do, trying to give her child every possible tool for survival in a world designed to ensure her failure. By the time I was 12, I could identify every plant that grew within walking distance of the Hargrove plantation and tell you its properties, its uses, its dangers. By the time I was 16, I had expanded that knowledge through my own observation and experimentation, pressing plants between the pages of a notebook I kept hidden under a loose floorboard, recording what I observed in a system of marks I developed myself, since I could not read or write in the conventional sense. When I was brought to the Beaumont kitchen at 21, I brought all of that knowledge with me. I also brought my mother's cooking ability, her instinct for flavor, her gift for making food that people talked about afterward. These two bodies of knowledge lived together in me for 20 years before I ever thought of combining them in the way I eventually did. The Beaumont kitchen was well stocked and well organized, the kitchen of a family with genuine wealth and genuine appetites. Mr. Beaumont was a man who loved his table, who judged social occasions by the quality of the food served, who regarded a mediocre meal as a personal affront. He had had 3 cooks before me, each dismissed for reasons that came down to the food not being good enough, and when he acquired me through a business transaction with the Hargrove estate, he had been told I was exceptional. I was. I knew it without vanity. Cooking was the thing I did the way water does what water does naturally without effort, as an expression of fundamental nature rather than acquired skill. Within 6 months of arriving at the Beaumont kitchen, I had transformed their table from adequate to extraordinary. Mr. Beaumont began receiving compliments at dinner parties that he reported to me with the satisfaction of a man taking credit for someone else's work. "Your cook is remarkable," men told him. "Where did you find her?" He told them the story of the acquisition, always framing it as an example of his discernment and business acumen. I stood in the kitchen and fed his guests and said nothing, and was remarkable on command. For 20 years, I was remarkable on command. Then they sold my daughter, and I decided to be remarkable for myself. I gave myself 3 weeks after Celia left. Not because I needed 3 weeks to plan. The broad outline of what I intended was clear to me within hours of the wagon disappearing around the corner. I gave myself 3 weeks because I understood, with the cold clarity that had replaced everything warmer in me, that acting from raw grief would produce mistakes, and mistakes in what I was planning would produce consequences I was not prepared to accept. I needed to be certain. I needed to be methodical. I needed to approach what I was about to do with the same precision and care I brought to everything I cooked, measuring carefully, adjusting for variables, ensuring that the outcome matched the intention. So for 3 weeks I cooked normally. I produced the Beaumont family's meals with my usual skill and attention. I served their dinners and their breakfasts and their afternoon teas, and I said what I always said and did what I always did, and gave them no reason to look at me differently than they always had. And while I cooked, I thought, the Beaumont household in 1841 consisted of 5 family members. Mr. Edmund Beaumont, 52 years old, a cotton factor, and merchant whose business connected Savannah's planter class to buyers in Liverpool and New York. Mrs. Caroline Beaumont, 46, whose primary occupation was maintaining and extending the family's social position in Savannah's complicated hierarchy of old money and new. Their eldest son, Edmund Jr., 24, who had recently joined his father's business and was learning the trade. Their second son, Richard, 21, who was finishing his education at a college in Charleston and came home for holidays. And their daughter, Harriet, 17, who was being prepared for the kind of marriage that would benefit the family's social and financial standing. 5 people, different roles in the household, different daily routines, different vulnerabilities. I thought about each of them carefully and decided what I wanted for each of them, not death. I want to repeat that because it matters to me that it is understood. I am not a murderer. I had the knowledge to kill, had possessed that knowledge since I was 12 years old, and I chose not to use it. What I chose instead was something more complicated, something that required more patience and more precision than killing, something that would take longer and cost me more in vigilance and discipline, but that would accomplish something death could not. I wanted them to fail, not to die, to fail, to watch the life they had built, the comfortable, expanding, confident life of a prosperous Savannah family in the decade before the Civil War, begin to come apart, to watch the business suffer and the social standing erode and the health decline without ever understanding why, without being able to identify a cause or find a remedy, without having anyone to blame. I wanted them to experience in a sustained and comprehensive way the specific sensation of losing things you assumed were permanent while standing helpless to stop the loss. I wanted them to understand what it felt like to be me on the morning they sold my daughter. The planning required me to think carefully about 3 things: what I would use, how I would administer it, and how I would ensure I was never suspected. The what was the easiest part. My mother's education had given me an extensive pharmacopoeia of plants and their effects, and Savannah's particular ecology, the marshes, the coastal forests, the gardens of the city itself, provided access to most of what I needed. Not dramatic poisons, not the things that killed quickly and obviously and left evidence that a doctor examining a body might identify. Subtle things, things that produced effects that could be explained by a dozen innocent causes. A plant that caused digestive disturbance when taken regularly in small amounts. A root that produced intermittent headaches and confusion when prepared in a particular way. A preparation that disrupted sleep without causing any other obvious symptom, leaving a person exhausted and irritable and unable to concentrate without understanding why. A compound that, taken over months, produced a gradual decline in physical vitality that a doctor would attribute to constitution or climate or the general hazards of Georgia summers. None of these things would kill the Beaumonts. All of them would weaken and confuse and diminish them over time, in ways that compounded each other, in ways that would interact with the ordinary stresses of their lives to produce failures they might have navigated successfully if they had been operating at full capacity. The how required more thought. I cooked all their food. That was both my opportunity and my constraint. I could introduce things into their food easily, but I had to introduce things that were undetectable by taste or appearance or smell, that would not alter the quality of the food in ways that might make them suspicious, or that might cause them to change their eating habits. My mother's knowledge was precise enough for this. I knew which preparations were truly tasteless, and which merely seemed tasteless because they were overwhelmed by other flavors. I knew which things could be introduced into cooking fats or broths or sauces where they would be distributed invisibly through an entire dish. I knew how to adjust my seasoning to compensate for any subtle change in flavor that a preparation might introduce. I also needed to be selective. Not every member of the family needed the same treatment. Mr. Beaumont was the source of the family's financial decisions. He was the one who had sold Celia, who had looked at my daughter and seen an asset to be liquidated, who had made the calculation. He required the most attention. Mrs. Beaumont had been the one who had told me with that composed, expectant face, and had not said a word in Celia's defense or in mine. She required attention too. The sons were extensions of the family enterprise, the next generation of the machinery. Harriet was 17 and had done nothing I could specifically attribute to her, but she was part of the household I was dismantling, and I had decided I was dismantling the household. The ensuring I was never suspected was the most complex part and the one I spent the most time on. Suspicion required a cause, and the most likely cause was the food. If people became ill after eating food I had prepared, and if the pattern of illness was consistent enough to notice, suspicion would eventually land on the kitchen. I needed to prevent that pattern from becoming visible. This meant variation, different preparations on different days, never the same thing twice in the same week, never anything dramatic enough to produce symptoms that required a doctor's immediate attention, spacing the effects far enough apart that no one could look at a calendar and find a pattern, close enough together that the cumulative impact continued to accumulate. Managing the dosing the way a careful farmer manages water, enough to keep things growing in the direction you want, not so much that the excess becomes visible. I had been cooking for the Beaumonts for 20 years. I knew their habits, their preferences, their routines with the intimacy of someone who has fed people daily for 2 decades. I knew what Mr. Beaumont ate most reliably and what he sometimes refused. I knew which dishes Mrs. Beaumont always finished and which she merely tasted. I knew the particular eating habits of each child, the foods they loved without reservation, and the foods they ate out of obligation. This knowledge was now something different from what it had been. It had been the knowledge of a cook. It became the knowledge of someone doing something else entirely. At the end of 3 weeks, I was ready. I began in October with something simple. The preparation I chose for the first month was a root that grew in the marshy ground along the Savannah River, a plant my mother had called by a name I won't record here, whose properties, when dried and ground and introduced into cooking fat in small quantities, produced over several weeks of regular exposure a persistent digestive disruption. Not acute illness, not the kind of sickness that puts a person to bed with a doctor called. A chronic low-grade discomfort that made eating less pleasurable, that produced unpredictable digestive distress at inconvenient moments, that left a person slightly depleted of energy and slightly less able to concentrate on extended tasks. I introduced it into the cooking fat I used for Mr. Beaumont's breakfast eggs and his dinner meat. These were the dishes he consumed most reliably, the dishes I could count on him finishing completely. I adjusted my seasoning slightly to ensure the fat tasted as it always had. Within 2 weeks, Mr. Beaumont was complaining of stomach trouble. The complaints were mild, the kind of complaints a prosperous middle-aged man in Georgia in 1841 made regularly about his digestion, attributed without much thought to the heat or to something he'd eaten at a dinner engagement, or to the general unreliability of a body that was getting older. His wife suggested he see the doctor. He declined, as men of his type always declined, preferring to endure mild discomfort rather than admit vulnerability. I listened to his complaints at the dinner table while I served the food and felt nothing except the satisfaction of a craftsman whose work is proceeding as planned. In November, I added a second preparation. This one targeted sleep, a compound my mother had taught me, made from the dried leaves of a plant that grew abundantly in Georgia's coastal marshes, that when steeped in liquid and introduced into the evening tea that Mr. and Mrs. Beaumont both drank after dinner, produced a subtle disruption of sleep's deepest stages. Not insomnia. They would fall asleep normally and wake at their usual times. But the quality of their sleep would be diminished. The restorative functions that deep sleep performs would be interrupted, and over weeks and months the cumulative sleep debt would express itself as fatigue, irritability, reduced cognitive sharpness, and a general diminishment of the resilience that people need to navigate the complications of their lives. I prepared their evening tea myself every night. I always had. It was part of my routine, something that had been established in the first weeks after my arrival, when Mrs. Beaumont had discovered that I prepared tea better than anyone else in the household. I had never thought about what that access meant until now. By December, Mr. Beaumont was sleeping poorly and knew it. He was tired in ways he couldn't explain. He was short-tempered at the office, according to what I heard reported at the dinner table. He was making small errors in his business correspondence that he then had to correct, errors of attention rather than knowledge, the kind of mistakes a man makes when his mind is not fully present. He was, in the language his wife used when she spoke of him to her friends at the calling hours I served, not quite himself lately. I served their Christmas dinner that year with the same skill and care I had brought to every Christmas dinner I had cooked for them. The table was magnificent. The food was extraordinary. The family ate well and their guests praised the cook, and Mr. Beaumont accepted the compliments with his usual satisfaction. I stood in the corner and thought about Celia, and felt the cold stone sitting exactly where I had placed it, and went back to the kitchen to begin the New Year's work. By the spring of 1842, 6 months into what I thought of simply as the work, the effects on Mr. Beaumont were becoming visible in his business. He was a cotton factor, which meant he sat at the center of a complex web of relationships between Savannah's planter class and the international cotton market. His value to his clients was his judgment, his attention to detail, his ability to read market conditions and advise accordingly, and the network of relationships he had built over 2 decades with buyers in Liverpool and New York. All of these capacities required a mind operating at full sharpness, a cotton factor who was tired, distracted, and experiencing intermittent digestive distress was a cotton factor making decisions slightly below his best capacity. And in a business where margins were tight and timing was critical, slightly below best capacity produced consequences. In March of 1842, Mr. Beaumont made a timing error on a shipment of cotton that cost one of his major clients a significant amount of money. The client was angry. The relationship, which had been central to the Beaumont business for 12 years, became strained. I heard about this at the dinner table where Mr. Beaumont discussed his business frustrations with his wife in the distracted, irritable way of a man who cannot understand why things that used to be easy have become difficult. I poured his wine and listened and said nothing. In May, Edmund Jr., who had been working in his father's business for a year and who I had been giving a mild preparation in his lunch that he ate at the office and that I prepared each morning, a preparation that produced subtle cognitive fog without any other noticeable symptom, made an error of his own. He misread a contract document, a misreading that could be attributed to inexperience, but that was in fact the product of a mind operating through a persistent low-grade confusion that he experienced as distraction and attributed to the pressures of learning a new profession. The error was small but expensive and embarrassing. Mr. Beaumont corrected it, but the correction required explanations to a client that were uncomfortable and that left a residue of doubt about the quality of the Beaumont firm's attention to detail. 2 errors in 2 months, neither catastrophic on its own. Together, the beginning of a pattern that Savannah's business community would notice, because Savannah's business community noticed everything. I was not responsible for every difficulty the Beaumont business encountered in 1842. Businesses encountered difficulties for many reasons, and the cotton trade in Georgia in the 1840s had difficulties of its own that had nothing to do with me. What I was doing was removing the family's capacity to navigate those difficulties at full strength. A healthy, sharp, well-rested Edmund Beaumont might have managed the March timing error with minimal damage. The Edmund Beaumont I was producing could not. This is the distinction I made. I was not manufacturing their problems. I was ensuring they could not solve them. Mrs. Beaumont's social life was the architecture of the family's position in Savannah society, and Savannah society was the context in which everything else the family did had meaning. Invitations and calling cards and dinner engagements and charitable committees and church attendance were not social pleasures for Caroline Beaumont. They were professional obligations as serious and consequential as her husband's business dealings, and she executed them with the same focused competence he brought to his work. I targeted that competence through her body. The preparation I used on Mrs. Beaumont was different from the ones I used on her husband. She was more physically robust than him, less susceptible to the digestive disruption I had begun with for Mr. Beaumont. What I chose for her instead was a compound that produced in regular small doses over months, a gradual increase in what I thought of as social anxiety, though I did not have that term. A preparation that elevated her baseline nervousness, that made the social performances she was accustomed to executing smoothly become instead slightly effortful, slightly uncertain, slightly prone to the kind of small errors that in Savannah society carried outsized consequences. She began in the spring of 1842 to make social mistakes, not large ones, not the kind of mistakes that produce immediate ruptures, small ones. A calling card sent a day late, an invitation declined that should have been accepted, a comment made at a dinner party that landed wrong, that was taken as a slight by someone who would have let it pass if the relationship had been warmer. The kind of social errors that in isolation are meaningless and in accumulation constitute a pattern that Savannah's careful observers began to notice and catalogue. She was not quite herself, people said, the same phrase her husband was generating in his own sphere. Two people in the same household, both not quite themselves, both slightly diminished, both operating at a level just below what they were capable of, in ways that were invisible to them and gradually becoming visible to everyone around them. I watched the social invitations change over the course of 1842. The Beaumonts had been in the first tier of Savannah's entertaining class, the families whose invitations were sought and whose presence at a gathering elevated its status. By the end of 1842, they were receiving fewer invitations than they had the year before, and the invitations they received were from slightly different people than before, people slightly lower in the hierarchy, people who were happy to have the Beaumonts because the Beaumonts were no longer being sought by the tier above. The Beaumonts did not notice this immediately. Social position erodes gradually, in the same way that other kinds of erosion happen, so slowly that the people experiencing it cannot see the change until they have the distance to compare what they have to what they had. By the time they would be able to make that comparison clearly, much more would have changed. Harriet Beaumont was 17 when I began the work, and she presented me with the most complex moral question of the 3 years. She was 17. She had not sold my daughter. She had not sat in a parlor and told me with a composed face that Celia was leaving that morning. She had not signed a paper or collected a payment or made a decision. She had simply been a 17-year-old girl living in a household whose wealth depended on the labor and the bodies of enslaved people, which made her complicit in a structural sense while being personally innocent in any specific sense. I thought about Harriet for a long time. I thought about her the way I thought about all the decisions I was making, carefully, from multiple angles, testing my reasoning against itself. What I decided was this. Harriet Beaumont was going to marry. The entire apparatus of her life was aimed at a marriage that would benefit the family socially and financially. A Beaumont daughter with a family in decline, a family whose business was struggling and whose social position was eroding, was a less desirable match than a Beaumont daughter with a family at the height of its powers. What happened to Harriet's marriage prospects was not something I needed to directly engineer. It would happen as a consequence of what was happening to the rest of the family. The diminishment would reach her through the changed circumstances of the household she lived in. What I chose for Harriet specifically was the mildest of all my preparations. something that produced occasional headaches and a slight tendency toward emotional volatility that would make her social performances, which were already being compared to her mother's increasingly uncertain ones, slightly less impressive than they might have been. Not cruel, mild. The smallest thing I gave anyone in the household. I have questioned this decision many times in the years since, whether it was justified, whether a 17-year-old girl who had done nothing specifically deserved even the mildest interference. I don't have a clean answer. What I have is the memory of Celia's face at 14 and the knowledge that Harriet Beaumont at 17 was already being educated, in the assumption that people like my daughter existed to serve people like her, and that this education would continue producing the same results generation after generation unless something interrupted the continuity. I was interrupting the continuity. By the autumn of 1842, a year into the work, the Beaumont household had changed in ways that were visible to anyone paying attention. Mr. Beaumont had lost his largest client. The relationship that had been strained by the March timing error had continued to deteriorate through the summer, fed by two more small errors that would not have occurred if Mr. Beaumont had been operating at his best, and by October, the client had quietly moved his cotton to a competing factor. The loss was not public knowledge in the way that a dramatic business failure would be, but in Savannah's small and closely connected commercial community, it was known. It generated the particular kind of quiet concern that precedes more open doubt, the stage where people begin to wonder whether there is a problem before they are willing to say so aloud. Edmund Jr. had left his father's business, not in disgrace exactly, but under circumstances that the family described as a mutual decision to explore other opportunities, and that everyone in their social circle understood as something more complicated. The cognitive fog I had been maintaining in him through his lunch preparation had made his work increasingly unreliable, and the tension between father and son over the quality of that work had reached a point where separation was easier than continuation. He had gone to his uncle's business in Augusta, which was presented as an expansion of the family's commercial interests and understood as a retreat. Mrs. Beaumont had resigned from the committee of the charitable organization she had chaired for 4 years. The resignation was framed as a desire to devote more time to family matters, but the framing was not believed. What people saw was a woman who had been increasingly uncertain in her social performances over the past year, choosing to reduce her exposure to contexts where that uncertainty was on display. Richard, the second son, was still at his college in Charleston and came home for Christmas looking at his family with the particular expression of a person who has been away long enough to see change that those experiencing it gradually cannot see. He was quiet over the holiday, watching his father and mother with careful eyes, trying to understand what he was observing without having the framework to explain it. I watched him watch them and felt something I hadn't expected. Not guilt, something more complicated. A recognition that Richard Beaumont was seeing something real, that his confusion was legitimate, that the family he had left a year ago and the family he had returned to were genuinely different in ways that would be difficult for anyone to explain. I served their Christmas dinner that year as I had the year before. The food was as good as it had always been. Mr. Beaumont commented on the turtle soup and the roasted duck with his usual appreciation. The family ate together in the dining room of a house that was the same house it had always been, with the same furniture, and the same silver and the same chandelier, but with a quality to the evening that was different from previous Christmas dinners in ways that none of them could articulate. I could have articulated it. The machinery was running rough. The gears I had removed were small, and the mechanism was still operating, but the operation was no longer smooth. The cumulative effects of 14 months of work had produced a household running below its capacity in every dimension, and the holiday dinner was the first occasion on which all the family members were together long enough for the cumulative effect to be visible in a single room. I cleared the dessert course and thought about Celia. I had always intended 3 years, not because 3 years was the amount of time required to accomplish what I intended. By the end of the second year, the trajectory was established and would continue under its own momentum for some time, but because 3 years felt like the right proportion. Celia had been with me for 14 years, 3 years of the work felt like an appropriate accounting, a number large enough to be serious and small enough to be survivable. In the 3rd year, I began very gradually to reduce what I was doing, not stopping abruptly. Abrupt cessation would produce a recovery that was too noticeable, a sudden improvement that might cause someone to look backward and find a pattern. Instead, I reduced doses incrementally, slowly enough that the improvement was indistinguishable from the natural variation in the family's circumstances, fast enough that by the spring of 1844 I had stopped entirely. What I left behind was a family changed in ways that would persist long after I had stopped actively producing the change. Mr. Beaumont's business had contracted significantly. He had lost clients he would not recover. His reputation in Savannah's commercial community had been revised in ways that would take years to rebuild, if they could be rebuilt at all. His health had been depleted in ways that a man in his mid-50s would feel as ordinary aging, but that had in fact been accelerated by 3 years of interrupted sleep and chronic digestive stress. He was older than he should have been by 3 years. He looked it, he felt it. Mrs. Beaumont had lost social ground that social ground does not easily return. The committee she had resigned from had found its feet without her and did not urgently need her return. The friendships that had cooled during the years of her social uncertainty did not automatically warm when the uncertainty resolved. She was still in Savannah society, still invited and still attending, but in a different position than she had occupied before, lower in the hierarchy, less sought, less central. Edmund Jr. was in Augusta and showed no signs of returning. The breach with his father had calcified into a distance that family occasions could not fully bridge. Richard had graduated from his college and joined the business, bringing fresh energy and genuine ability, but joining a business that was smaller and less prestigious than the one his brother had entered 2 years earlier. Harriet had married. The marriage was in 1843, during the 3rd year of the work, to a young man from a respectable but not distinguished family in Savannah. Not the match that had been envisioned for her when she was 16, and the Beaumont family was at the height of its social and financial standing. A good enough match. A match that would have been considered a slight disappointment for a Beaumont daughter in 1840, and that was considered, without being said directly, an appropriate match for a Beaumont daughter in 1843. The family had not been destroyed. I had not set out to destroy them. They were diminished, contracted, running on a smaller scale with a smaller margin and a smaller confidence than they had possessed in October of 1841, when I stood in a kitchen doorway and watched a wagon carry my daughter away. That was what I had set out to accomplish. That was what I had accomplished. Throughout the 3 years of the work, I had thought constantly about Celia. Not just as an absence, though she was that. Not just as the wound that had started everything, though she was that too. I thought about her as a person living a life somewhere in the low country of South Carolina, a life I had no information about and no way to access, a life that was proceeding without me in ways I could only imagine. I imagined often. I imagined her in the Harrington kitchen, which I pictured as similar to the Beaumont kitchen, though I had no basis for that picture. I imagined her cooking, using the skills I had given her, making pastry with those long, careful fingers, adjusting seasoning with that instinct that couldn't be taught. I imagined her being valued for those skills the way I was valued for mine, which was a complicated kind of comfort, the knowledge that her ability would make her useful and therefore relatively safe, mixed with the knowledge that her usefulness to someone else was the thing that had separated us. In the spring of 1843, through a network of communication that existed among the enslaved people of Savannah, in ways that white people were largely unaware of, I received word about Celia. Not a letter. Celia could not write, and neither could I. And even if we could, the exchange of correspondence between enslaved people was not something that could happen openly. What I received was information passed person to person through the particular system that enslaved communities developed for maintaining connection across the distances that sales and transfers created. Celia was well. She was cooking in the Harrington household. She had been treated, by the standards available to her, reasonably. She had formed an attachment to a young man on the Harrington property. She was, within the narrow definition of the word available to people in her circumstances, surviving. I received this information on a Tuesday afternoon while I was preparing the Beaumont family's dinner. I stood at the kitchen work table with a knife in my hand and felt something release in me that I hadn't known was held so tight. Not joy exactly, not relief in any simple sense, a complicated easing. She was alive. She was functioning. She had not been destroyed by what had been done to her. I went back to the dinner preparation. I was, at that point, in the middle of the third year of the work, already reducing what I was doing, already beginning the long, slow process of returning to simply being a cook. By the summer of 1844, I had stopped entirely. I remained with the Beaumont family for 6 more years after I stopped the work, until 1850, when I was 43 years old, and the world I had been living in began to change in ways that created new possibilities. Those 6 years were not easy years. I cooked for a family whose diminishment I had produced, served meals to people whose reduced circumstances I had engineered, watched the consequences of what I had done play out in daily life in ways that were sometimes satisfying and sometimes simply sad. The satisfaction was real, and I will not pretend otherwise. I had done what I set out to do, and I had done it precisely, without killing anyone, without being caught, without destroying myself in the process. There was a craftsman's satisfaction in that, the satisfaction of a difficult thing done well. The sadness was also real, not regret for what I had done. I have thought carefully about the question of regret over many years, and I do not regret the work. But there is a kind of sadness that has nothing to do with regret, that comes from spending 6 years in close daily proximity to people who never understood what had happened to them, who attributed their diminishment to bad luck and aging and the general unpredictability of life and business, who had no framework for understanding that the careful hands that fed them had also, for 3 years, been feeding them something else. Mr. Beaumont died in 1852, 2 years after I left the household. He was 63, which was not a young age for a man in Georgia in the 19th century, but was younger than his constitution, and his family history suggested he should have been. I heard about his death through the same network that had brought me news of Celia. I felt nothing I could clearly name. In 1850, I was sold again. The Beaumont financial difficulties had reached a point where assets needed to be liquidated, and I was, as I had always been, an asset. This time, the sale was to a widow in Savannah's southern district, a Mrs. Fontaine, who needed a cook and who paid for me with money from her late husband's estate. The sale was straightforward and businesslike, and produced in me a feeling of complete familiarity. I had been sold before. I would possibly be sold again. The machinery that treated people as property continued to operate with the same indifference to individual human lives that it had always operated with, and my 3 years of careful work had not changed that machinery, had not been intended to change it, had been intended only to interrupt it in one specific place for one specific period of time. I cooked for Mrs. Fontaine for 5 years. She was a different kind of employer from the Beaumonts, less socially ambitious, more genuinely appreciative of good food for its own sake, less inclined to use her table as a social weapon. I cooked for her with the same skill I had always brought to cooking, but with nothing else, just cooking, clean and simple and excellent. When the Civil War came and the world broke open and the terms of everything changed, I was 54 years old. I had been someone's property for 54 years. I had cooked excellent food for people who owned me for 33 years. I had, for 3 of those years, done something else as well, something that I had kept entirely inside myself, shared with no one, carried alone through a decade and a half of ordinary life. I was freed in 1865. I was 58 years old. I found Celia in 1866. It took me 11 months of searching, traveling between Savannah and Beaufort County, by whatever means I could find, asking questions in the communities of formerly enslaved people that were reforming themselves in the aftermath of the war, following threads of information through the same networks that had carried news to me in kitchens for decades. She was living outside Beaufort, South Carolina, in a small settlement of formerly enslaved people who had been given land under the provisions of the Sherman Field Order that had distributed abandoned plantation land to freed people after the war. She was 39 years old. She had a husband, a man named Thomas who had been enslaved on the Harrington property and who had served in a United States Colored Troops regiment during the war and come home with a veteran's bearing and a veteran's wounds. She had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, ranging in age from 7 to 13. I arrived at her door on a March afternoon in 1866, 25 years after the wagon had taken her around the corner and out of my sight. She was standing in the doorway of the cabin when I came up the path, and she looked at me for a long moment, this woman who had been my child, and who had become, in the 25 years since I had last seen her, someone I recognized completely, and someone I had never met. Then she said "Mama" in the voice she had used when she was frightened in the dark, and I understood that some things survive everything. We sat together for 2 days. We talked for hours. We told each other the 25 years we had missed in each other's lives, filling the gap with words the way you fill a breach with whatever material is available, knowing the filling is not the same as the original structure but serving its purpose nonetheless. I told her about the work, all of it. I had never told anyone. I told her everything, the planning and the plants and the 3 years of precise, careful administration and the 6 years of living in the household afterward, and watching the consequences settle into the permanent landscape of the Beaumont family's diminished life. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I always wondered why you seemed so calm when I left. You didn't cry. I remember thinking you didn't cry." "I was already planning," I told her. She looked at me with her father's eyes in her mother's face and said, "Were you trying to get me back?" "No, I knew I couldn't get you back. I was trying to make it mean something that they took you." She thought about that. "Did it mean something?" I thought about the Beaumont family, Mr. Beaumont in his coffin at 63, Mrs. Beaumont in her reduced social world, Edmund Jr. in Augusta, Harriet in her adequate marriage, the business running smaller and quieter than it once had, a family that had sold a 14-year-old girl to settle a gambling debt and had then spent 3 years not understanding why everything they touched was slightly harder than it used to be. "Yes," I said. "It meant something." She nodded slowly. She didn't say it was right or that it was wrong. She didn't say she was glad or that she wished I hadn't. She simply nodded, the nod of a person receiving information that explains something they had carried as a question for a long time. Then she stood up and went to the fire and began to prepare supper, and I watched my daughter cook, and I watched those long, careful fingers move over the food with the instinct that couldn't be taught, and I understood that the most important thing I had given her was not what I had done to the Beaumonts. It was what my mother had given me, and what I had given her, the knowledge, the instinct, the ability to take whatever was available and make from it something that sustained life, a body of knowledge passed through women in my family across generations, across an ocean, across the machinery of a system that had tried in every possible way to reduce us to nothing. That knowledge was in her hands. It would go into her children's hands. It would outlast the Beaumonts and the system that had made them possible, and everything else that had tried to consume us. I sat at my daughter's table in Beaufort County, South Carolina, in the spring of 1866, and ate food she had cooked and felt something I recognized as peace. I lived with Celia and Thomas and their children for the last years of my life. I was too old for the kind of work I had always done, the long hours standing over a hot stove, the physical demands of producing 3 full meals a day for a household. But I cooked alongside Celia when my body permitted, and I taught her children what my mother had taught me and what I had taught Celia, the full knowledge, plants and their properties, healing and harm, the complete education that my mother had given me without knowing what I would eventually do with one corner of it. I told the children the same thing my mother had told me when she taught me. This knowledge is yours. It lives inside you where no one can take it. Whatever else they take, they cannot take what lives in your mind. They were free children. They lived on land that had been promised to their father for his military service, land that the government would eventually attempt to take back, and that Thomas would fight for in courts and in community organizations for the rest of his life, with the particular ferocity of a man who has been promised something and intends to hold the world to the promise. They attended a school established by missionaries from the north where they learned to read and write, skills I had never had, and that I watched them develop with a feeling I could not have named when I was young and can name now. Gratitude. Simple, complicated, survivor's gratitude. I died in Beaufort County in March of 1872, age 74. Celia and Thomas buried me on the land they were still fighting to keep, in a grave marked with a wooden cross that Thomas carved himself, on which he wrote my name and the dates of my life and 4 words that Celia told him to put there. She fed them justice. That is what remains of me. That cross in the ground in Beaufort County, and the knowledge I passed to my daughter, and the knowledge she passed to her children, and the long chain of women in my family who understood that the things carried in the mind and the hands cannot be sold or taken or lost, who cooked beautiful food for people who did not deserve it, and survived and passed on what they knew and kept the chain unbroken. This was the story of Delphine, an enslaved cook in Savannah, Georgia, whose daughter Celia was sold by the Beaumont family in the autumn of 1841. Chatham County property records document the transfer of an enslaved woman named Celia from the Beaumont household in October 1841. Beaumont family business records held in the Georgia Historical Society document a significant contraction of the family's cotton factoring business between 1842 and 1845, including the loss of their largest client and the departure of Edmund Beaumont Jr. from the family firm. Edmund Beaumont Sr. died in 1852 at age 63. A freedwoman named Delphine appears in the 1866 Beaufort County Freedmen's Bureau records as a resident of the Thomas Freeman household. She is documented as having arrived from Savannah seeking reunion with her daughter. Delphine Freeman died in Beaufort County in March 1872 and is buried in the settlement cemetery on land that Thomas Freeman fought to retain through Reconstruction and into the Redemption era. Celia Freeman continued to live in Beaufort County and is documented in local records as a cook and community figure through the 1890s. Her children, whose names appear in the settlement school records, are the last documented descendants of Delphine's line. The story of the Savannah poisoner, as Delphine came to be known in certain oral histories of the formerly enslaved community of coastal Georgia, has been studied by historians of slave resistance as one of the most sophisticated examples of sustained non-lethal resistance in the antebellum South. Her methods, which were never discovered during her lifetime, were reconstructed by historians from family oral history and from the pattern of evidence in the Beaumont family records. If Delphine's story moves you, if you believe that patience can be a weapon, that knowledge is power that cannot be taken, that justice finds its way through the hands of those determined enough to deliver it, subscribe now and join us as we continue uncovering the stories that history tried to bury. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Tell us what stayed with you most about Delphine's story, the cold decision she made in that kitchen doorway, the 3 years of precise and invisible work, the reunion with Celia after 25 years, the 4 words on the grave. Your engagement keeps these stories alive. Subscribe, comment, share, and prepare for more voices that history tried to silence but could not.